without further ado, Rachel Brown.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much, Lynn, for inviting me, and Lori. This is just such an honor and privilege to be here and to be in this space to talk about this theme. My name is Rachel Brown, and I'll just tell you a little bit about my background before I dive into this presentation. I have for over a decade now really worked at the intersection of communication and conflict. I got my start in Kenya, where I lived and worked and founded an NGO that worked on election violence prevention, interrupting rumors, fear-mongering, and the ways in which communication was leading an escalation towards violence. I then was a fellow at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in DC at their Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide, where I studied dangerous speech and how we could confront it, and I'll talk more about that today. I stayed squarely in that world doing international work for several years before founding Over Zero. We began work in Central Europe, in Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovakia, and Poland, and soon turned towards the US, where most of our programming now is. So I hope today to be able to share with you some of our approach, some of the knowledge from our team, and from my own experience. So just to say a little bit more about Over Zero. Again, we are an organization that's focused on preventing identity-based violence and other forms of political violence and group-targeted harm. And not only preventing this type of violence, but addressing it where it occurs, and working to build societal resilience to the types of drivers that move us towards these harms, towards this violence. We focus especially on the role of communication, on the types of narratives that pave the way towards violence, understanding how we can identify them, notice them as one of our earliest warning indicators that things are headed in a harmful direction, and understand how and why they're so powerful so that we can effectively interrupt and counteract them. So we focus on communication, and I want to talk for a minute about why communication, because I think sometimes people hear communication and they think just about a simple campaign. We define communication pretty broadly, and it is such a central part of the human experience. It's part of what it sets us apart from other creatures, right? It's how we make meaning in the world. It's how we form groups and understand where we belong. It's how we connect with other people, and it's the only way that we coordinate and collaborate with others. Again, we define communication broadly as every way in which humans exchange information. A song, a sign, a symbol that we might wear, our words, our writing, right? There are so many ways that we're communicating with each other all the time. And so we don't just look at communication as a set of, for example, written words. We look at communication, when we look at communication, we try to understand not just what is being said, what is being communicated, but how and from whom, and how communication is spreading and traveling in a community or a society. And when you take this broad view of communication, we can see that communication and conflict are inextricably linked. The type of violence that we care about is violence that happens targeting specific groups of people based on their identity or between entire groups of people. We don't form groups without using communication. We don't make meanings of events and come to understand people as other without using communication. We don't mobilize collectively towards violence without communication. And so everywhere where we see these types of violence that we're so concerned about, we see also that communication is weaponized to move us towards violence. And while this is problematic, it's precisely because communication is such a central part of the human experience, because it's so central to how we work together and collaborate and do things together, that we believe that communication can also be an incredibly powerful tool for prevention. So communication and conflict does a few things, but in a really simple way to put it, one of the things that it does is it takes us from a landscape of us and them, a landscape where we can live together, and we can have all different parts of our identity, right? I can be a woman who is Jewish. I can have a political affiliation. I can be a big Orioles fan because I'm from Baltimore. I can be a cat lover and a dog lover and a peace builder and a creative writer. All of these parts of myself can coexist, and I can connect to people across different lines of difference. So we live in this world of us and them. We always create different groups and spaces of belonging, different versions of an us. But we don't always see someone who is outside of that group, what we might call an in-group, as threatening. So what communication and conflict does is it moves us from this landscape of us and them to us versus them, where suddenly another group we start to see them as a threat. We start to believe that an entire group of people is somehow in competition with us, right? We start to move towards a zero-sum mentality where if they gain, we win, and if we win, it means that they must have to lose. And then when we move towards extreme cases of violence, such as genocide and mass atrocity, we move into a realm of us or them. We're occupying just one part of our identity, and it's not just that we're in competition we see ourselves as competition with another group. It's that it is an existential moment. It is us or them. We cannot both exist. Right? And this is what starts to justify large-scale violence against entire groups of people, is this existential us or them idea. And so these types of zero-sum messages about an in-group, and these are identities that get constructed, right? You could construct a division around any of those identities of my own that I just mentioned, right? But a very clear, rigid identity of who is us is created, and then zero-sum messages about an other, about a them, and about us can exacerbate conflict. This is Slobodan Milosevic here, who took narratives often actually about history and histories of conflict and threat between different groups, because the reality of the present was actually that people were mostly living peacefully together, right? So he was able to manipulate and drive home these narratives to help divide people from each other and fuel conflict. So what do these messages look like? I want to first talk about the types of narratives, the type of stories that embed themselves in a society. And just to back up for a second, we predictably see patterns of communication over and over again that lead to conflict and that lead to violence. And when it comes to genocide and mass atrocity, which is what I study, we see these patterns repeat over and over again throughout history and across different contexts. And these are messages about an other. These are messages that other a group or multiple groups of people, as well as messages that create an us, that create a very rigid version of us. So what are the narratives that other? What are the narratives about this idea of a them? We see something called threat construction. This is the idea that an entire group of people is a threat. If I've done something wrong, if I've harmed someone, generally, I've turned off the mic. Is it working? Okay. If I've done something wrong, if I've harmed someone in some way, what is my best line of defense if I don't want to be punished for it, if I don't want to be held responsible? Apology. I like that. I wish.
It was their fault or they earned it or something?
It's self-defense, right? Right? I was just defending myself. If I've hurt someone in some way, generally, if we say that it was in self-defense, that sort of they were the one that started it, right? Then we can defend ourselves. And this is no different when it comes to justifying violence against a group. We see this over and over again. The idea that this entire group of people, is somehow an existential threat to us. They're a threat to our values, to our way of life, to our purity, to our physical safety and security, and our very existence. And it's not just an individual person, it's not just the actions, it is something in the essence of the group that is threatening. A Hutu propagandist during the Rwandan genocide called this an accusation in a mirror. He was borrowing from other propagandists, and he suggested they use this. To make genocide feasible, they had to accuse the people that they were going to perpetrate genocide against of planning the same thing against them. So their narrative was in part that the Tutsi would commit a genocide against the Hutu if they did not do it first. So threat construction, right? So this narrative of self-defense. And then guilt narratives. This group has already done something wrong. And it's, again, not that individuals have done something wrong, not that a person should be punished or a group of people should be punished, but this entire group, in their essence, bears guilt, including, to use another example from the Rwandan genocide, including children, right? They somehow were already guilty of the horrific crimes that people had committed long before they were born. So this idea of collective guilt leads to this idea of collective punishment. In social psychology, it's called collective blame. And then finally, we have dehumanization and de-identification. They are somehow not like us. They are somehow fundamentally different from us, this other group, and they are less than human. They're fundamentally not human. We see this in its most overt sense with comparisons to animals, to cockroaches, to vermin, to pests, to rabid dogs. These are all examples that we've seen. These are often threatening animals, right? And so it removes a sense of moral agency to an entire group of people by saying they're less than human, and helps contribute to this sense of threat. These things work together, and at their core, one of the things they have in common is that they make the case that an entire group of people, it essentializes an entire group of people. It says they all share an essence that is somehow fundamentally different from our essence, rather than recognizing that as humans, we all share an essence, right? So these narratives, I think, are often the easiest ones to pick out, right? They feel bad when we see them. They're obvious. I think more innocuous are narratives about us. These are narratives that are created that focus on the group that is being mobilized to violence. This comes from work of Jonathan Leader Maynard, whose work I really highly recommend. But he talks about destruction of alternatives or removal of agency. These narratives portray violence as the only option. Because this group is so threatening, so guilty, and less than human, we don't want to do violence against them. We don't want to do this type of violence, but we have no other choice. This is often a protection narrative. We have to protect ourselves. And this leads me to the next point, which is the valorization of violence. So violence is virtuous. Violence is what you do if you're a good member of our group. Often if you're a good man. This comes often, again, with narratives that say we must protect our women and children, really objectifying women especially as sort of objects in need of protection. And then there's a future orientation. This often comes with sort of a utopian vision that says, well, again, we don't want to do violence, but we have no other choice but to ensure our future safety and security and thriving. And we have to do this for our children. We have to do this for women if you're a real member of our group. And if we do this, we can build a better future. We can build this sort of beautiful vision of a utopia. So these things all work together. And one of the things we see happen through this is also that one of the first groups, and I walked in this morning and I saw this is on the back wall here. One of the first things that happens is that moderating voices within groups speaking out against violence, against dehumanization, get attacked first and get silenced. So altogether, what does this do? And I draw here from studies of social behavioral psychology, cognitive neuroscience, studying conflict and how humans operate in groups. This, first of all, and again, I'm looking at the back wall here, so much of this is laid out here. It pushes us into these very singular and rigid and zero-sum identities, right? So suddenly all these identities I have that let me interact and engage and connect with different people, I lose hold of them. We're just categorized into these very specific parts of our identity, and they're seen in competition with each other. It creates a very clear and exclusive us, right? This us that needs protection with very strong social pressure. So we think about the narratives of othering. Again, often these are the most intuitive. But just as important are the narratives that say, this is the boundaries of us. This is the boundaries of who's sort of a real human and deserves protection. And then there are really strong social pressures for people to go along with these narratives and with violence. This sort of preys on our human wiring and desire and need for belonging within a group. So it activates, these narratives activate people towards violence, but they also silence people that could effectively speak out against violence. So when it comes to these patterns of rhetoric, it's our belief that it's not enough just to counter them. We can't just sort of argue with these patterns of speech. We have to understand a layer below the surface. What are they doing? How are they manipulating how we understand these boundaries of identity and this sense of threat? We have to counter what the narratives are doing, not just what they're saying. We have to change social pressures. We have to shift how rigid people's sense of identity are, for example. So these narratives also don't exist in a vacuum. Work from Susan Benesch in the Dangerous Speech Project identifies a few things that we really need to pay attention to. One is context, right? We need to understand the strength of institutions, the history of conflict between two groups. Violence and these narratives don't happen in a vacuum. Are there power dynamics? Are there long-standing grievances? But also, are the institutions in a society capable of preventing violence? What is the communication ecosystem? Is it just someone on the street corner yelling these narratives, or is it spreading widely through different channels, whether it's through radio, whether it's through public speeches, whether it's through television, or nowadays social media? Who are the messengers, right? Are they people that are seen as authorities and people in positions of influence with power and charisma and the ability to mobilize? And are there audiences that are capable of mobilizing to violence, whether those are sort of official militaries or militia groups capable of acting on these narratives that they are reaching? So we are in a museum that gives us many examples. I want to give just a couple examples to really just point out what I'm saying, and then I want to shift us into what we can do about it. The first example is from Myanmar. This is Uwi Radu, a leader of the 969 movement, which is a very anti-Muslim movement and helped pave the way towards the genocide against the Rohingya people. And he says, "You can be full of kindness, but you cannot sleep next to a mad dog." Critically, he's a monk, and he's going out and making this type of statements in his robes. He's posting on his Facebook page using Buddhist imagery. He's got pretty wide distribution. People tape his sermons. They would spread them around and listen to them. And here, a mad dog means a rabid dog. And we know that there's nothing you can do with an animal that has rabies to cure it. There's nothing you can do, right? Sleeping next to a mad dog, a dog with rabies, is as sure as signing yourself up to get rabies and die, right? So he, as a religious authority, as a moral figure, is saying you can be full of kindness, right? You can be a good and moral person, but you have no other alternative because the threat is so big and it's so inhuman and there is no other way to handle it, right? So here he is justifying violence. Here is a quote from Ratko Mladic during the Srebrenica genocide. "Here we are on 11th July 1995 in Serb Srebrenica. On the eve of yet another great Serb holiday, we give this town to the Serb people as a gift. Finally, the time has come to take revenge on the Turks in this region." So here we have a narrative of guilt, right? We have him using far historical narratives and calling back these myths about a past and this idea of what the Turks have done. And he's talking about not only the other, right? Not only this sort of vengeance and avenging past harms, but he's really talking about the us, right? This is our holiday. This is the future that I'm giving to you. And finally, this is a quote that comes from much closer to home. This is a famous quote in white supremacist movement here in the United States. It's called the 14 Words. It says, "We must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children." And I think that this is an important example, because you'll notice that in this example, there's no other group that's mentioned, right? And these are famous 14 words. If we took them out of context and we took out the word white, we might not really think much about it, right? The context is that he was in a shootout. He was calling for violence. He was calling for violence at all ends. He was calling for violence against non-white groups of people. It's part of this statement is part of a much broader ideology, but this has become a famous slogan that people hang on to, right? And this is future orientation, right? This is about the future and the safety. It implies an existential threat. If we must secure the existence of our people, that means that there's a chance that our people won't exist, that our children won't have a future. So there's an implication here of an existential threat from an other. There is a call to do what it takes, we must, this sort of valorization. And there is that implication of an existential threat and promise of a better future. So what I want to say is that it can feel overwhelming when we start to see these narratives take hold, when we start especially to see them spread by figures that have authority, when we start to see them spread across channels, and when we start to see the mis and disinformation that is always used to fuel, because these narratives are never true about a group of people. They require a level of lies. But we do have agency, and I think that what's really critical to note, I talked about how these narratives not only activate some people, but they silence others. And so I think one of the most important things that we can always do is remember that we have agency. And I find the study of these patterns of speech to be incredibly informative and helpful, because I think that we can recognize them before they come fully to fruition. I think we can start to see and reflect and notice where in our society we see the seeds of these ideas and start to figure out how to counter their impact. So what I want to do, something I also find instructive, is to look at different case studies that we can learn from. Where have all of the incentives been right for people to engage in this type and level of violence, but they've chosen not to? In any case of civil war, genocide, mass atrocity throughout history, you will find individual upstanders, people who at great cost, great risk to themselves, stand up against violence and take action. What's more unique and unusual is to find entire communities that do so. And so I want to give a few examples of where in history and in the world that's happened, and then pull out some of their commonalities. And what's interesting is that those commonalities match some of the things that we know from social and behavioral psychology and neuroscience and all of these other fields about how humans act and what matters to influence our behavior. So let's get into some case studies. The first case study that I want to talk about is the city of Tuzla. This is a city in Bosnia. And during the war across Bosnia in the 90s, something that was very unique about Tuzla is that its residents from all different ethnic, national, religious communities that were party to the conflict lived and worked peacefully together throughout the duration of the war, even when they were put under siege. And this did not happen by accident. Early in the war, nationalists started trying to make headway in Tuzla. They started working on the media front, they started working on the political front. But several different actors took actions that ultimately defeated those efforts. One was the mayor. The mayor saw the signs coming, and he actively activated a Tuzlan identity. He said, "We are Tuzlan, and this is what it means to be Tuzlan." He framed the threat not as people's neighbors, not as people from other ethnic, national, religious groups, but as the division itself that threatened to come to Tuzla. And he early on set social pressure, set social norms to tell people that what it means to be Tuzlan is that we are not going to give in to this division. We're going to live and work together. He did things like commission a song about Tuzla and go on a speaking tour all around the city. But simultaneously, local civic groups got together. And so you had this coalition of civic groups that said, we are not going to participate in this violence. It included everyone from the miners' union to religious leaders, and they worked together with the mayor. So you had these two platforms in coordination with each other. And so not only did they set those norms, did they push back on the nationalism, they managed to keep their security forces, their police force, from becoming sort of an ethno-nationalist entity. They managed to deal with different tensions that arose. At one point, a religious leader from one community, local mufti, was kidnapped, right? And another group wanted to retaliate. And instead of doing so, they were able to come to the mayor and tell him what happened, and he was able to negotiate for the mufti to be released, and there was no retaliation. When the community was under siege, instead of letting that divide them, they came together and shared resources with each other of how to survive under siege. Their radio station helped people communicate with people in other parts of the country. When shelling came from outside the city and killed young people who were at a soccer game for peace, they worked together to mourn their losses. So they did not let these things that could have been dividers divide them. And they did that again by activating in this Tuzlan identity and organizing together across all of these different groups. I want to talk about another case study from Bosnia, which is the Jewish community in Mostar. And if people have questions about this, my colleague who just arrived in the back actually lived and worked in Sarajevo for quite a while and worked on a documentary. So the Jewish community in different parts of Bosnia during the war actually took action. For example, in Sarajevo, starting a pharmacy where they smuggled medicine to all of the different groups. But in Mostar, there was a very strong leader, Zoran Mandelbaum, who led the Jewish community. And he made sure that the Jewish community there understood that it was their role to support their neighbors from all different ethnic groups and to push against the violence. And they did things like smuggle people to safety, right? They did things like rescue people, and they did things like smuggling supplies to civilians in all different places. So they organized together, and they organized with their Jewish identity and their Jewish values. And he set, thank you so much, he set these strong, again, social norms, but not just norms and social pressures, reminding people what their value was and what it meant to be Jewish. And again, through doing that, this entire community, not just one individual, but a community, was able to coordinate and work together to be able to push back on the violence and take courageous efforts to rescue people. We have a really similar example actually from the Muslim community in Rwanda. In Rwanda, the Muslim community was quite an isolated and segregated community in the context of the broader country. And so religious leaders in the Muslim community played a very big role. And the Muslim community was comprised of both Hutu and Tutsi. And so when the genocide came, the leaders also saw the rhetoric coming early on. And they started to teach people prior to the genocide, they started to talk to them about what to do in times of ethnic division. They said, they used quotes and passages from the Quran that talked about never taking human life. They set expectations that if there was violence, if there was division, people would not participate, but would instead engage in activity to rescue those who were being attacked. They used also lines from the Quran that warned of a time of temptation that might come and test their faith. And they said that in a time of temptation, in a time of division, what it means to be a Muslim is to resist that temptation and again, rescue your neighbors. This community, throughout the course of the genocide, rescued many victims, potential victims. They hid Tutsi in houses and moved them from house to house when militias came to inspect them. They ferried people across rivers to safety. They faked mass burials so when militias came to inspect, they could pretend that there had been killings. They sheltered people in mosques, and actually there is even an account where a militia showed up to a mosque and demanded that they separate into Hutu and Tutsi. When they refused, many people were killed. So they did this even at the cost of death. And they did this as a community, again, just like the Jewish community in Mostar, coordinating together, still at great risk, but not only as individuals, as a community and through their identity and their values. I want to also talk about an example from the United States, the racial terror lynchings that we saw at the turn of the century. And the response and the very multifaceted response to this identity-based violence at large scale in our country's history. So the anti-lynching movement was made up of many different actors. This included a constellation of actors who engaged people within their distinct spheres to take action against lynching. Really importantly, the narratives that justify these racial terror lynchings were very similar to what we just talked about. And in particular, what they often did was justify lynchings by claiming that Black men had viciously raped and assaulted white women. So lynchings were framed, racial terror lynchings were framed as a way to protect the purity and the safety of white women. Ida B. Wells, with her reporting, was able to show that in almost every single case this was not true. Lynchings were generally the result of a consensual relationship between two people, or they were because someone had been successful in business. But this narrative was incredibly dominant. So her reporting was able to shatter that narrative and help create momentum to push back on this violence. The NAACP was, of course, also involved. The Coalition for Interracial Cooperation is another group that formed and was very active in the South. And a lot of these groups were made of Black leaders across the country and then white leaders from the North, but they had a very hard time engaging white leaders, white individuals from the South, who were often engaged in perpetrating these harms. They used a lot of different mediums for communications, from reporting to putting out other written pamphlets to meetings. And they proactively disseminated accurate information to be able to challenge that dominant narrative about lynching. But also the CIC worked very hard to try to specifically engage white women in the South, because that's whose name these lynchings were being done in. And they were eventually, after quite a long time of organizing and pushing, successful. And so a sort of little known and complicated story is that of the Association of Southern Women for the Prevention of Lynching. And this is another interesting example because it's another example of people working within their own community to shift those norms and pressures. So these women leveraged their identities as well-respected white Southern women. They didn't try to pretend to be otherwise. And through doing that, they were able to reach a really hard-to-reach group. They use their existing networks for advocacy campaigns to be able to get people to sign on to a sign-on letter saying, we will not have these lynchings done in our name. It is because of our identity as white Southern women that we need to stand up against this. But they also use their networks. They also mobilized wives of local sheriffs to get sheriffs to intervene when people were going to a jail to try to drag someone out for a lynching. They worked with media to monitor media narratives and try to change headlines around facial terror lynchings to be more accurate. And they tied their vocal opposition to lynching to their values as Southerners rather than in spite of them. So here I think we see kind of a combination of those other examples. We see the coalition of actors that was necessary to expose these narratives that justifying violence as false and to create advocacy and momentum around them. And then we have these individuals that were able to take action within their own community to drive down instances of lynching. This is a complicated case study because this coalition eventually fell apart when the ASWPL opposed federal anti-lynching legislation. Studies have shown that lynching decreased compared to what you would have expected in the areas that they were active, but we can agree that there's lasting harm from that final decision. So there's a lot of complicated lessons learned here about what it means when coalitions of groups get together and also when people work within their own groups. But I want to surface these case studies because they all show us what can be possible and give us things to consider. I will move into the very last part of this presentation before we maybe talk together, but I want to talk about some lessons from these case studies and then what we can do. In all of these case studies, leadership predicted violence, that violence was coming at a large scale, or they saw that there was endemic violence that they could intervene in. And they didn't just wait and respond after an incident of violence, they responded proactively. And that matters because it can be very hard to engage and to activate once violence begins. It can become confusing and chaotic, and there are so many pressures to fall silent. And not only did they respond proactively, but if we remember some of the things that we talked about with those narratives, they divide us into these rigid identities. In all of these cases, they pushed back on that, right? They promoted alternative identities, and they used them to mobilize communication, action, a space where people could belong and take action together. We know that people are much less likely to take action on their own. So whether it was their Tucson identity, their Jewish identity, their Muslim identity, their identity as women, right? They mobilized people based on identities that broke them out of these conflict lines. And then the leadership, these different leaders communicated using all different channels. They didn't just sort of make a one-off statement. They saturated the space. They did creative things like using songs. They used pamphlets. They went on public speaking tours, right? They did everything they could to engage and saturate that communication landscape. And then they also responded to triggers and violence. They were set up to do that rapid response for when it happened and manage tensions. So these examples have in common, just to summarize, anticipation, preparation and proactive action, not waiting for the violence to come. And that anticipation requires recognizing some of these earliest signs. And in all of those cases, some of what they saw was the narratives. It required collaboration between different leaders. So again, not asking people to just act on their own. It takes so much courage and bravery. And it's really not how we're wired as people. We like to be part of communities, part of groups, and are more likely to do things when we can do them together. That strong communication across multiple channels. And all of the narratives that they seeded, they didn't just push back and get in an argument with these dangerous narratives. They had messaging that understands groups and human psychology and human wiring with their activation of identities and different social pressures and social norms, and narratives that helped guide people through confusion and fear towards positive action. So we have multi-day curriculums on this, but I want to flag here and leave us with some notes on what does this mean for what we can do if we start to see seeds of division, seeds of violence in our communities. One is communicate to undermine dangerous speech. What does this mean? We can set positive norms, right? Positive social expectations. We know, this is one of the biggest findings from social psychology in the last decade, that the thing that influences our behavior most are what we think all or most of our peer group is doing. There have been studies about this from everything from binge drinking on college campuses. They found that people generally overestimate how much their peers binge drink. So one of the best ways to drive down binge drinking, they try all these campaigns, studies show, is to actually correct that misperception, to let people know how many people actually binge drink. They realize it's not the majority, it's not as many people as they think, and it drives down binge drinking overall. It means that all the anti-drug campaigns of the 90s were a pretty big failure, right? Because they said, everyone's doing it, just say no. This is a different example, but it's just the same in conflict, and it's actually sort of on steroids, right? Because now it's so much more important to belong to a group when we have these singular, rigid identities, fear, threat. So setting positive norms early on and telling people that this is what we're going to do as a group, this is what you can expect from your peers, creates space and gives a permission and a safety in taking positive action. And when conflict divides us into different groups, and when there start to be a lot of social pressures within those groups, proactively defining and reaffirming identities and values matters. Whether that's taking a pre-existing identity and saying, such as the ASWPL example, and saying it is because of our values, not in spite of them, that we oppose lynching and this should not be done in our name, or whether it's sort of activating an identity that exists but is more latent, like a Tucson identity, right? Or whether it's, again, taking an identity like the Jewish identity or Muslim identity and helping define for people proactively what that means and how they can engage. So defining and affirming identities and the values that are tied to them, right? This has to do with setting norms. Proactively communicate correct information. Like I said, we say mis and disinformation now. I used to say rumors, fear-mongering, propaganda. This has always been part of how violence between groups happens. Proactively identifying where there might be rumors, fear-mongering, etc., and proactively getting out correct information, asking people to question what they see if it causes them to feel fear of another group, etc., can be really important. Reframe threats and help people through difficult emotions. In Tuzla, they framed the threat as division, right? In Rwanda, same thing. They framed the threat as temptation to go against your values. In the Jewish community, in Mostar, again, they didn't frame the threat as the other. They framed the threat as the division and the war that was ongoing. So helping people navigate when there is a sense of threat and fear, unsafety, insecurity, and navigate those difficult emotions, not just leaving them to be manipulated. Ensure a sense of agency. That destruction of alternatives makes people feel like there's nothing I can do, right? I can be a good person, but I have no choice but to go along with violence. Or just the fact that the cost of engaging becomes so much higher when there's a sense of violence, when there are these dangerous, dehumanizing narratives, it can drive people to disengage. So we need to make sure that people maintain a sense that what they do matters and that they have choice. This is really important, and it's something that I think that in those faith leaders, in those faith communities, in those examples, really, really did strongly. Model compassion in action. Don't just tell people about it, but show it in action, show what it looks like, and tell those stories. This really matters to create an alternate narrative, because when violence and when these narratives come on the scene, they tend to dominate. They suck the oxygen out of the room, and people think that that's all that's going on. Telling alternate stories, alternate paths can help with everything we're talking about. There are also feedback loops. I'll give one example. A common narrative we see to construct threat and drive groups apart from each other is they hate us. They dehumanize us. They see us as less than human. Social psychology teaches us that when we think that a group dehumanizes us, we tend to dehumanize in turn. When we think that a group hates us, we feel threatened and we have less empathy for them, right? So cutting off some of these cycles, research also shows that if we can show we humanize you, groups humanize in turn. So if we can show groups humanizing each other, it can actually be sort of a virtuous cycle rather than a vicious cycle. Have difficult conversations, right? Where we see these narratives taking hold in our own communities or with our loved ones, have those difficult conversations. Engage with compassion. Know, as we talked about, that this is an emotional landscape. It's activating emotions like fear, disgust, anger. It's activating people's need to belong, right? So this is really an emotional landscape on which these narratives happen. And if we can engage where we see them and do so and have difficult conversations with compassion, it can matter. And when communities are targeted with violence, show up for each other. And often it's multiple communities that are being targeted and they're sort of pushed away from each other. But making sure to be in touch with and engaged with any community that might be targeted with violence in your own community, building those lines of communication and starting to show up for each other can be really, really powerful. And coordinate. This is advice we always give to people. Because it's so hard to work alone, because we see that, and it doesn't have to be in an extreme case. We use those examples. So same way we look at the extreme of speech to see when the seeds are planted, we can look at what people have done in the hardest context to ask, what can we do now to prevent? What can we do early? And one is to build diverse networks. So talking to your networks, making sure that these conversations are open. Connecting to others, right? So thinking about who you might not be in touch with, but maybe if you knew them, you'd be better positioned to coordinate if something happened. Maybe if you knew them, you'd be better positioned to activate other identities or build new narratives or just understand the broader experiences. Consider who you are as a messenger and where you have influence and how you can use that platform. And it's really important to show, don't just tell, right? We can use words, but it's in actions and examples and stories that this comes to life for people. So even when we're not in an extreme, even when we just start to see this type of division or these types of narratives enter, what can we do that undermines the sort of truth of those narratives? What can we do that builds a different story? And then when there are those positive actions, to tell that story, right? And to get it out there and to communicate using all of these different channels to really model what this looks like. This is a way to set norms, for example. And then it's really, really important. It can be easy just to be against the dangerous narratives or the division or the violence. It's really important to be for something as well, right? To define what that is, because that's the thing that people can activate. I used to think a lot about in peace building, there's negative peace, which is just an absence of actual violence. There's positive peace, where you've resolved some of the underlying grievances. And I always like to think of what is an active peace, right? What does it look like to actually do peace? Because violence is associated with actions. Those actions get attention, right? They become a story. What does it look like to figure out the actions that go with peace and that create their own story? So it's really important that we figure out. And I thought about this a lot when I talk to marketers, who they're never getting people just to not do something. When they try and understand behavior, they're trying to figure out little tweaks to get people to do even small things. And they know that if you want to shift people, it has to come with an action, not just an absence of action. And so how can we have an active piece, and how can we make sure that we are building a vision of what we're for, that people want to join and want to be part of? I know that that's a lot. I have so much more that I could share. We can go into detail. We can talk together. But for now, I just really want to thank you all for listening to this presentation. I'm so grateful, again, for the opportunity to be here in this incredible space. I'm so grateful to Lynn and to Lori and to all of you for being here. Thank you so much.